1998. 4 Microsoft engineers create a prototype video game console in the hopes of competing against Sony's next video game machine, the PlayStation 2. March 1st, 1999. Sony officially announces the PlayStation 2 following the amazing success of the original PlayStation. March 10th, 2000. Microsoft officially announces their first video game console. It is known simply as Xbox.
So, for the first time, let me now unveil Xbox.
In 2004. Sony sits comfortably ahead of Microsoft and Nintendo, with roughly 71 million units sold. Microsoft, at the end of 2004, had sold 19.9 million Xboxes. May 12, 2005. Microsoft reveals the Xbox 360 on MTV. Days later, on the 16th, Sony reveals the PlayStation 3 at E3. The modern video game battle of the 21st century begins.
Now the time has come. You've waited long enough. I give you the future of gaming.
The Xbox 360 announcement was nothing short of a spectacle. With viral marketing campaigns and an over-the-top reveal on MTV with Elijah Wood hosting the event, and live performances by The Killers, the system was touted for its online capabilities and HD graphics. Microsoft's online ecosystem, Xbox Live, was going to the next level. With a marketplace where users can download games, demos, music, television, and movies, users can now play games online with friends, send messages, earn a reputation score, and system-wide achievements. Shortly after the reveal, Microsoft spent their entire E3 conference showcasing their new Sony killer, by showing off the system's user interface, controller, and games. Call of Duty 2, FIFA 06, Project Gotham Racing 3, Cameo, and Gears of War were among the titles shown. With little emphasis on the technical specifications and full focus on the system's entertainment capabilities, Microsoft wanted the world to know Xbox 360 was here to play.
That future starts right here, right now. This is my Xbox 360. It's here, and it's on.
The PlayStation 3 reveal was a completely different story, as Sony spent a vast majority of their E3 conference detailing the technical significance of the platform, detailing the system's new cell processor, reality synthesizer, and support for Blu-ray discs. Various tech demos were shown to demonstrate the power of the system, with many developers and industry figures discussing the overall proposal of what the system could do. The system was touted for having 6 USB ports, 2 HDMI ports, 3 Ethernet ports, slot readers for compact flash, SD, and memory stick, and full backwards compatibility with PlayStation and PlayStation 2 games. Sony proceeded to spend a smaller portion of the show on actual titles. Games like Resistance, Motorstorm, Killzone, Warhawk, Heavenly Sword, and Gran Turismo were showcased. No user interface was shown, and the promise of online connectivity was seldom. The show ended with a look at the console's design, and the E3 booth later showed the console's radically redesigned Boomerang controller. It was clear, Sony's message was different. It wasn't about fun, it was about power.
Impromptu Best Buy shop, and all of the new Xbox 360s are being unloaded.
The road to launch was long and arduous for both manufacturers. Microsoft was eyeing a holiday 2005 window, and Sony spring 2006. Microsoft was able to hit their goal, launching the Xbox 360 November 22, 2005 in North America. Shortly after, in December, the system hit Europe and Japan. Xbox 360 was offered in 2 different SKUs, The core system offered the console, a wired controller, and standard AV cables for $299. The main Xbox 360 bundle came with the system, a 20GB detachable hard drive, wireless controller, headset, and component cables for HD. The bundle retailed for $399. Games like Call of Duty 2, Need for Speed Most Wanted, Perfect Dark Zero, and Cameo Elements of Power were available at launch. There were 18 games total to choose from day one. Microsoft's only enemy on November, and the year to come, was themselves. Sony and Nintendo were far from ready. Despite being the only player on the market, Microsoft immediately struggled with supply. Maximum production was not enough to sufficiently supply demand, and most units were entirely sold through in the US and Canada. By the end of 2005, roughly 900,000 units were sold in North America, 500,000 in Europe, and 100,000 in Japan. Demand at the time was so high that 40,000 units reappeared on eBay within a month of launch. Nearly 10% of the system's first 400,000 units shipped to the US. Demand was seemingly high everywhere, but Japan, a problematic market for Microsoft. Whether it was nationalistic preference, the region's desire to play handhelds, or the 360's lack of Eastern titles at launch, Japan would continue to be the land of low sales figures for Microsoft. Though getting a foothold in Japan was the least of the company's worries with the Xbox 360. As early reports after launch indicated, many consumers were experiencing technical problems. Various concerns such as the system scratching discs or displaying a general hardware malfunction were cropping up too frequently for it to be a coincidence. Microsoft at the time reaffirmed the public that hardware failure for the platform was in line with most consumer electronics, typically 3 to 5%. It wouldn't be until 2007 that Microsoft officially acknowledges the problems. Despite these concerns, Microsoft had an entire year lead on Sony, something that played a very large role in the long term for not only consumer preference, but developer preference as well. And while the first year of games were mostly PC ports and HD upgrades, there was always something to play. By year's end, Dead Rising, Saints Row, Viva Pinata, and Gears of War released, all of which were well received. And the aggressive tone from their 2005 reveal was still as prevalent as ever. Microsoft did not forget Sony was launching. At E3 2006, Peter Moore made the deliberate announcement of Grand Theft Auto releasing on Xbox 360 the same day as the PS3 version, and that the 360 version would feature exclusive episodic content on Xbox Live.
Is my new edition. Microsoft and Rockstar Games are bringing Grand Theft Auto 4, the next generation of the wildly successful Grand Theft Auto series, to Xbox 360 on October the 16th, 2007 in North America, and October the 19th, 2007 in Europe. The first date it's available.
That, coupled with various other titles Microsoft had planned for 2007, showed that they meant business. Microsoft also had a direct answer to Blu-ray, offering a $200 accessory that allowed the 360 to play HD DVDs, a completely separate format from Blu-ray that Microsoft had backed, directly competing against Sony's decision to go with Blu-ray in the optical format war. By the time PlayStation 3 was ready to launch, Microsoft had sold roughly 6.5 million Xbox 360s. Before launch, the PlayStation 3 and Sony's message was categorically a disaster to say the least. Sony had strong competition, yet felt no threat was on the horizon. It was as if the PlayStation 3 was the only platform coming, and it was the only platform anyone cared about, and this was far from the truth. Harsh realities really set in when the public got a closer look into what the PS3 was going to be at their 2006 E3 press conference, a show that the internet will likely never forget, as it was and has been mocked for years.
It's Ridge Racer! Ridge Racer! Remember that one?
Genji 2 is an action game which is based on Japanese history. So here's this giant enemy crab.
Is the feel of the controller in my hands. I like the hard plastic.
and the little knobby bits.
The public got a look at the PlayStation Store, the promised online functionality, some PSP connectivity, and plenty of footage of games to come. Some crowd-pleasing moments like Metal Gear Solid 4 and Final Fantasy XIII were quickly forgotten at the end of the show when Kaz Hirai famously announced the PlayStation 3's overwhelmingly high price.
The 20GB PlayStation 3 will retail for $499 US and 549 Canadian dollars. And the 60GB PlayStation 3 for $599 US, $659 Canadian.
Price was high, and yet Sony was going to lose money. A lot of it. The controller reverted back to the original design without rumble functionality. The original amount of USB, HDMI, and Ethernet ports were scaled down. The system was going to be supplied with standard video cables, but that wasn't enough. The PS3 and the components inside were too much to manufacture. And while it was common practice for Sony to take a loss on hardware in order to sell software, each PS3 sold would mean a $200 loss, over $800 to manufacture one system. Though at the time, PS3 was technically a bargain, as the system was also a Blu-ray player, and dedicated Blu-ray players were going for well over $1,000. All hurdles aside, PlayStation 3 launched November 11th, 2006 in Japan. Shortly after, the system hit North America on November 17th, with a European launch being delayed to 2007. There was two models to choose from, 60GB and 20GB. The 20GB lacked Wi-Fi, card readers, and a chrome trim. The initial low supply of units caused a number of violent incidents, with customers being robbed, there were riots, and even one man getting shot. eBay was a very lucrative option for most, with systems typically selling for well over $1,000. However, enthusiasm was low, and with the PS3 out in consumers' hands, the growing pains started to show. Online capabilities were at the absolute bare minimum. The PlayStation Store was just a fancy web browser, and there was no cross-game chat, and games had visibly worse performance compared to the 360 versions. Sony's messaging wasn't entirely helpful either, with most ads creating confusion rather than actual desire. PS3 just had a poor reputation, and was the laughingstock of the internet. You couldn't go to any gaming-related website without finding a PS3 meme or console debates. And it wasn't just gamers. Developers were very vocal about the platform and how difficult it was to develop for. A contributing factor for why the system frequently saw games with lesser performance than the 360 versions, despite the PS3's untapped potential. PS3 did have a few breaks though. Online play was free, the system was future-proofed with Blu-ray and a standard hard disk drive, and you could install Linux on it. And it offered a great value when comparing its hardware features to 360, where a lot of the features were sold separately.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
You're 7 months into the sales cycle for PS3, and you're cutting prices. Why?
Well, as you pointed out, it's a two-pronged announcement. The introduction of the 80-gig machine with our million-unit-selling MotorStorm game packed in at $599, and then consequently reducing the price on the existing 60-gigabyte model to $499.
Within the first year, Sony got the message. PS3 needed work. Rumble was added back to the controller, and firmware updates added requested features to the OS. Hopeful game announcements like Little Big Planet and PlayStation Home were made. The system was even price dropped to as low as $399, with the announcement of the 40GB model. But this came at the expense of PS2 backwards compatibility, a feature that Sony stayed keen on removing in order to bring down manufacturing costs. By the end of the PS3's first full year, the system saw Resistance Fall of Man, Warhawk, Uncharted Drake's Fortune, and Ratchet & Clank Future Tools of Destruction as the standout titles to play. The future was bright, but there was still a long way to go. By June 30th, 2007, PlayStation 3 sales reached 4.3 million. Microsoft at the same time was at 8.3 million.
We set up these two Xboxes here, the one in home theater. The first day, the DVD Madden we had on display was totally destroyed because of the inside. It totally scratched the whole DVD. So, first time we put it up there, it froze. We're like, okay, it was just fluke, maybe something happened. It froze again. So guys, honestly.
Internally, Microsoft's Peter Moore has now fully grasped the gravity of the situation on their hands. The defect rate for Xbox 360 was far too high to ignore, and action had to be taken. Moore worked out with the finance team just how much it was going to cost to make things right. He recalled, "We knew we had a problem. I remember going to Robbie Bach, my boss, and saying, I think we could have $1 billion problem here." Moore had a meeting with then Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer to tell him what had to be done. I am trembling sat in front of Steve, who I love to death, but he can be an intimidating human being. Steve said, "Okay, talk me through this." I said, "If we don't do this, this brand is dead. This is a Tylenol moment." Steve looked at me and said, "What have we got to do?" I said, "We've got to take them all back, and we've got to do this in a first-class way." "What's it going to cost?" I remember taking a deep breath, looking at Robbie, and saying, "We think it's $1.15 billion, Steve." He said, "Do it." There was no hesitation. July 5th, 2007, Microsoft officially announces a 3-year warranty extension to all Xbox 360 consoles from their original purchase date. New internal chipsets were on the horizon to hopefully help the console's failure rate, but for now, every consumer was covered for free Xbox repairs should their machines fail under the 3 red lights moniker. Amidst all the controversy and debate of PS3 and Xbox 360, the Nintendo Wii saw tremendous demand, and by September 2007, the Wii officially surpasses Xbox 360 in total worldwide sales. This would be the beginning of Nintendo's mostly irrelevant dominance as gamers continued to scrutinize PS3 and 360 while largely ignoring Nintendo due to Wii's radically different approach to games. But there was something very important in September. Halo 3, one of Xbox 360's most important titles, coveted and revered worldwide. The game was a huge success, and is still fondly remembered by all to this day. By the end of 2007, Xbox gamers were enjoying not only Halo 3, but fantastic titles like Mass Effect, BioShock, Lost Planet, and Crackdown, all of which were only available on 360 at that time. Though one shocking announcement to all was that Bungie would be leaving parent company Microsoft and going fully independent in the future. Peter Moore would also be leaving the company as well. As 2007 came to a close, one thing was for certain. Sony had a lot riding on 2008, while many thought Microsoft didn't have enough after Halo 3.
Toshiba has announced it will no longer develop, make, or market HD DVD players and recorders. That effectively means an end to the high-definition format war, with Blu-ray emerging as the clear winner.
2008 started off with a small, yet important victory for Sony as Toshiba announces they've essentially conceded in the format war, ceasing production of HD DVD. This wasn't necessarily a loss to Microsoft, given the HD DVD platform was purely an add-on device to the Xbox 360. But Sony, however, had a lot riding on it in that they had a hand in the creation and development of Blu-ray, with every PlayStation 3 shipping with a Blu-ray drive for games and movie playback. And while the benefits weren't immediately obvious in 2008, the victory meant a long-term win for Sony with residual revenue. But more so for the PS3, Blu-rays could hold more storage than a traditional DVD, and thus more content could fit into one disc. This was just the beginning of what would be a solid year for Sony in slowly molding the PS3 into a product people wanted to buy and use. The platform holder started to deliver major firmware updates, giving highly requested features to users. In-game cross-media bar finally allowed PS3 users to access their messages and friends list while they were playing a game. Sony adopted Microsoft's achievement-based system with the inclusion of trophies, and they relaunched the PlayStation Store with a much cleaner and user-friendly interface. Sony's marketing also improved noticeably with commercials that seemed to actually make sense, and if that wasn't enough, June 12th delivered one of the PS3's most important exclusives. Metal Gear Solid 4 saw critical acclaim, and Sony saw a pretty substantial increase in PS3 sales across all markets, which the company desperately needed, because by June 23rd, it was revealed in financial reports that pricing PS3 below manufacturing costs made the company lose over $3 billion. Sony quoted to investors, "The large-scale investments required during the development and introductory period of a new gaming platform may not be fully recovered." Basically, it was going to take a lot to ever see a return on PlayStation 3. And in July, E3 2008 is where the company held a show heavily focused on promising exclusives. Infamous, Killzone 2, MAG, God of War 3, and more were shown off, all the while still juggling PSP and PS2 into the mix as well. Though one of the biggest surprises at E3 was at Microsoft's show.
One more big announcement to share. Take a look at this movie.
What was once considered a PlayStation exclusive is now no more. The gaming landscape was in utter shock that a mainline Final Fantasy would now release day and date on Xbox alongside PlayStation. For many, this was seen as a nail in the coffin for Sony. If PS3 can't keep games like Final Fantasy or Devil May Cry exclusive, why would anybody need to buy one? Little did anyone know that this would pretty much be the norm moving forward, as third-party exclusives slowly but surely became a thing of the past. By year's end, Resistance 2 and Little Big Planet released, and more stellar titles that many enjoyed. PlayStation Home also saw an open beta release, which looked promising on the surface. 2008 seemed to be a mostly good year to the PS3, and yet the sales weren't enough. The grass was indeed much greener on the other side. Microsoft saw great numbers all throughout the year. It was either good hardware sales, a good attach rate, or an increase in Xbox Live subscriptions. Most major third-party releases were playing better on 360 and selling better too. Microsoft had the distinct advantage in just having an all-around better platform when factoring everything in. A gold subscription was keeping gamers grouped together, and Xbox Live was simply a more robust place to play games anyway, with cross-game chat and a native party system. When a major blockbuster release like Grand Theft Auto 4 or Fallout 3 would hit, 360 was the place to play it for many. And it wasn't just the third-party preference, as 2008 also saw Ninja Gaiden 2, Fable 2, and Gears of War 2. Xbox Live Arcade also continued to be a preferential storefront for many smaller independent developers, with games like Braid and Castle Crashers releasing. And while Sony is releasing features that play catch-up, Microsoft is completely revamping the UI with the new Xbox Experience, which came out later in the year. A completely new interface that presented the menus and games in a more modern fashion, with an emphasis on tiles and imagery. And Microsoft's new Me-like avatars added a little flavor to user profiles. All in all, Microsoft had a great 2008, and while Sony made good strides in rebuilding the PS3 image, it wasn't going to catch Xbox anytime soon. By year's end, 360 sold 28 million units worldwide. PS3 was in the neighborhood of 21 million. Down, but not out. Things were now heating up. 2009 was the year both companies started to really prepare for their future, as their machines get to a comfortably low price point for many potential customers to now buy in. Sony opened the year with Killzone 2 and Demon's Souls, and much to everyone's surprise, Killzone 2 actually lived up to most of its high expectations. Demon's Souls was also an unexpected surprise to many as well. And as the year progressed, games like Infamous and Ratchet & Clank: A Crack in Time also saw great reception. It was finally getting to a point where you could say the PS3 had a great library, and in large part many of those games were only available on PS3. And it's at this point that many developers are not only getting more comfortable developing on PS3, but more smaller studios are working on the platform as well. The PlayStation Store was now seeing a greater influx of games released, either ports from Xbox Live Arcade or day-and-date releases with the competing storefront. E3, however, was bigger than ever, as this was the year both Sony and Microsoft revealed major expansions to their hardware. Sony officially unveiled PlayStation Move, which at the time were only referred to as PlayStation Motion Controllers. They demonstrated the tech's impressive one-to-one capabilities and made a case for how it could be applied to games for the future. The peripheral was slated to be released the following year.
You can imagine if he could be Ratchet and he could hold Ratchet's weapons in his hand while he plays. He would die for that.
Microsoft revealed Project Natal, a camera sensor with the promise of making you the controller and interacting with your body and voice. There were multiple demos shown for this as well, demonstrating how the device could be used in games and Xbox avatars. Peter Molyneux also showed off what appeared to be a highly advanced AI utilizing the camera as well, though this was met with extreme skepticism and later never came to fruition.
Hi, I'm Milo. How you doing?
Hi, Claire. You okay?
Actually, I'm a bit nervous.
You? Nervous? I don't believe it.
Just as E3 came and went, fall showed up with more business from Sony. Arguably one of the biggest turning points for PS3 was Gamescom 2009, where much like Sony always does with their hardware, it was time for a revision. The rumored console and price cut were official. A slimmer PlayStation 3 would be hitting the market at a much more affordable $299 price tag. Not only this, but Sony even went as far to rebrand the system in a small but substantial way. The font would revert back to the more traditional PS1 and PS2 style, and Sony would start a very successful ad campaign that caught the attention of many. The timing went well with PS3's biggest 2009 release that was only a few months away. This was the momentum finally needed for the PS3 to gain a little bit of traction. Sony rounded out the year with a new price, console, and bright future with more exclusives announced and waiting for 2010. Microsoft spent a good portion of 2009 more in prep mode. Forza 3 and Halo 3 ODST kept fans quenched in the interim, while Microsoft readies a dramatically new approach to games with Project Natal and upcoming exclusives like Halo Reach, Alan Wake, Fable 3, and Crackdown 2. And while 2009 still saw total sales domination from the Wii, that didn't keep most gamers from spending their entire holidays playing Modern Warfare 2. In the end, Sony finally reached a profit after major restructuring and layoffs, and reached 33.5 million PS3 sales. Microsoft would not give updated figures until April 2010 to coincide with the platform reaching 40 million units sold.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your new Xbox 360. Completely redesigned for the future of entertainment.
Sony opened 2010 strong with major releases like Mag, Heavy Rain, God of War, and the announcements of Little Big Planet 2 and Killzone 3. The new marketing campaign featuring fake Sony executive Kevin Butler also seemed to be performing well and was starting to paint PS3 in a positive eye. It was at this point where PS3 not only gained serious momentum in sales, but overall public image of finally being a desirable, affordable, and fun gaming console. Microsoft on the flip side also saw a strong opening with then exclusive Mass Effect 2, which wouldn't make a PS3 debut until the following year. Not all was well with Sony, however. On April 1st, the company removed the Other OS feature from PS3 via a firmware update. The Other OS feature was a way for consumers to install operating systems like Linux onto the PS3, and this was initially advertised as a feature of the PS3. Many fans found this to be very insidious and anti-consumer, and Sony was met with a lawsuit that would later settle in 2017. But a little bit after that, Sony launched PlayStation Plus, a monthly subscription service that would give out free games. At the time, it was met with skepticism, but this was Sony's way of luring users to pay monthly on PS3 for something that actually gives back, instead of Xbox Live, which simply required a fee for online play. This later turned into a big success, as Microsoft later adopted this strategy in 2013, doing games with gold. Come E3 2010, the general air in the video game industry is a bit different. Both Sony and Microsoft are now committed to showing the world more of their chosen motion-controlled peripherals. Sony spent half an hour or so demoing PlayStation Move, which turned out to be slightly awkward and uninteresting. But the rest of the show was filled with pleasant surprises. Kevin Butler stole the show for a bit and made a cheesy speech.
I love drifting a turn at 100 miles an hour in boss battles with a 600-foot-tall Greek god who may or may not be your father. Gaming is having a ridiculously huge TV in a tiny one-room apartment.
Gabe Newell surprised everybody by making an appearance and vowing Portal 2 will be best on PS3.
Now, I've been pretty outspoken in my comments about the current generation of game consoles. And I think that gamers will be delighted with features like Steam Cloud and automatic updates that will make the PlayStation 3 version of Portal 2 the best version on any console.
And Sony went a little over the top announcing Twisted Metal. Microsoft showed great footage of their upcoming games, but also spent a large portion of their conference demoing the Kinect sensor, which understandably frustrates your typical gamer that would want to watch E3, but pleases investors who want to see potentially high-selling products. Microsoft's Don Matrick closed out the show revealing the Xbox 360S, a slimmer and more efficient Xbox 360 that would be available immediately. And in the following months, both motion peripherals launched and initially sold very well, except Microsoft did exceptionally well. Just when it seemed like Sony was making decent headway into Xbox 360 sales, Microsoft reinvigorates the platform with a new form factor and family-friendly games that use a new impressive camera sensor. The marketing and games were a complete success, and Kinect became the fastest-selling consumer electronic device. And with holiday releases like Halo Reach, Fable 3, and Call of Duty Black Ops, core Xbox 360 gamers were pleased for the time being. Sony ended the year announcing Uncharted 3: Drake's Deception in December. Sales figures tell an interesting story. PS3 was now around 48 million units worldwide. 360 was at about 51 million. The sales gap Microsoft had was indeed shrinking.
Sony's PlayStation Network, and now your credit card info could be at risk. The online network has been down since last Wednesday. Sony just announced yesterday that
2011 was once again a promising year for Sony to make a move on Microsoft, but a major snag came up. On April 20th, Sony acknowledged that PSN was having issues and that some services were down. Shortly after, the company confirmed that there was an intrusion on the network and that service would continue to stay down for a few days while they investigate what exactly happened. On April 25th, Sony announced that the time needed to fix and rebuild the network would be longer than expected. All the while, many customers were curious as to what exactly was accessed on the network, with Sony not openly admitting much else besides the third-party intrusion. It only took another day for Sony to confirm suspicions that personal data may have been compromised. The week after, local government agencies in many countries got involved, questioning the severity of the breach with Sony directly. On May 1st, Sony confirmed that there would be a welcome back compensation package to customers as a means of goodwill, though this was still announced rather early as the network still was not ready to be opened again. There was also an additional attack on Sony Online Entertainment, which held back the restoration of services. The outage was officially over after 23 days, with PSN slowly returning on May 14th. Sony offered free games and themes back to returning users and a $1 million credit card insurance policy good for 1 year. The company was hit with a lawsuit and fined £250,000 British pounds under British law. Sony says the breach cost them $171 million. This didn't just cost money, but public image. What was considered one of the biggest data breaches ever is now hindering the sales momentum the PS3 had going. Meanwhile, Microsoft is seeing incredible sales numbers for Xbox 360, and more specifically its Kinect sensor, which is why a big portion of their E3 show in 2011 was once again heavily focused on Kinect demonstrations. But many gamers and Microsoft's core audience was starting to recognize that most of the company's efforts were now focused on only casual games, and the remaining exclusives were just more Halo, Gears of War, and Forza. This is when a slight shift began with Microsoft's fanbase, in which many felt the company wasn't focusing enough on what gamers really wanted. Despite these concerns or any debates that would happen on the internet, Microsoft pressed forward with Kinect-focused games, while Sony ended up releasing Uncharted 3, Infamous 2, Resistance 3, and a myriad of other exclusives that seemed to be releasing on a bi-weekly basis, whether they were bigger titles or more niche. By November 2011, the sales gap was now less than 2 million units. PS3 was at 56 million, 360 was at 57.6 million. With the PSN breach behind, 2012 was more or less a similar story in that Sony continued a consistent release of exclusive games, and Microsoft insisted on more Kinect. And while Sony did have an agenda as well in pushing PlayStation Move sales and software, it ultimately didn't pay off nearly as well as Kinect did for Microsoft. By March 2012, Sony's Fergal Gara openly admitted that the hardware had not lived up to their expectations. PlayStation Move fell into obscurity at this point, and wouldn't be made relevant again until its use in PlayStation VR years later. E3 2012 was the point in which Microsoft began to see serious backlash. They spent a large portion of their E3 conference showing third-party games, Kinect, and TV and video services. Games like Halo and Forza were not cutting it anymore for Microsoft's core audience. Sony's E3 showcased a few exclusives and spent a portion of the show focusing on PlayStation Vita, but they closed strong with extended footage of The Last of Us, a game which by release in 2013 went on to make an incredible impact on the industry standard. And during TGS 2012, Sony announced a further revision of the PlayStation 3 with more gigabytes and a lower price. January 2013 was the month Sony had been working towards for more than 6 years. It was being reported that PS3 shipments have now surpassed 360. And while units shipped did not necessarily mean units sold, this was the point in which Sony was now about to outsell Xbox 360. And once May rolled around, it was reported as official. PS3 lifetime sales passed Xbox 360. Both machines were at 77 million units, with PS3 a few thousand higher. And with that news came the conferences that would bring the announcement of next-generation hardware from both Sony and Microsoft. The world was now learning about PS4 in February and Xbox One in May. With all eyes pointing towards next-gen, PS3 and 360 started to cool down slightly. Microsoft revealed the Xbox 360e at E3, and Sony released The Last of Us in June. On April 20th, 2016, Microsoft officially ended manufacturing of new Xbox 360s, and Sony slowly ceased PS3 shipments by territory, with Japan being the last one, ending May 29th, 2017. When everything was all said and done, with updated numbers, PS3 sits at roughly 86.9 million units, while 360 sits at 85.8. In actuality, Nintendo reigned supreme in the 7th generation of video game consoles, selling over 100 million Wiis, though most can agree. The interesting battle was that between Sony and Microsoft, and while one could argue that Sony beat Microsoft and overcame all odds, it stands to reason that Microsoft is credited with jumpstarting Sony's perspective on the games industry and refocusing the company on what matters most. Microsoft finally penetrated the market, and could be taken seriously after only selling 24 million original Xboxes. Xbox Live pioneered the online gaming ecosystem with party chats, gamer score, and a reputation system. It became the platform everybody wanted and needed to play with friends. While Sony figured they could do whatever they wanted with their hardware, release it at any price, release it whenever they want, and make an architecture that's so complex that they didn't care about what their software creators would have to deal with. But then slowly realizing that they can't just do whatever they want, that they would surely lose all of their customers to a competitor that they never considered a threat, carefully spending years of calculated efforts to rebuild the image of the PS3 and release great games that people want to play. Sony did play catch up, and if it weren't for Microsoft, PS3 may not have ended up being so great in the end. Microsoft would not learn from their mistakes until after their next generation hardware, Xbox One. In the end, neither system truly won. While PS3 overtook 360 by a million consoles, it stands to reason that they both pretty much evened out, and it's that very fact that made the entire life cycle such a close race. PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 were the first truly connected HD social consoles, and with that came the many growing pains that ultimately fell onto consumers, whether it was failing hardware or network breaches. But one thing can be said with the utmost confidence: some of the best games ever made were released on these platforms. Regardless if it was PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360, over 160 million gamers worldwide can agree. The 7th generation was one hell of a ride. Hey everyone, it's Ryan. Thank you so much for watching this documentary. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you didn't see, I actually did 2 other ones, one on the PlayStation Vita, another one on the PlayStation 4. So if you didn't see those, go check those out. And if you are new to the channel, subscribe for the best PlayStation news, reviews, and updates here on YouTube, and more long-form video game documentaries. Speaking of which, any support is greatly appreciated at patreon.com/MysticRyan. I'm sure you've heard many of the YouTube spiels before, which is that it's a very tough platform sometimes, and doing long-form 30, 40-minute plus videos takes a lot of time and effort, and YouTube's algorithm and SEO is very messed up. Sometimes all that effort can kind of go down the drain. Any support on Patreon is greatly appreciated, but of course you do not have to, but there are a little few extra perks on there I try to get back to as well. Otherwise, subscribing is also just as much support as always. I appreciate everything you guys ever do for me. It's always, you're always so awesome. Other than that, that's all I've got for you. I'll see you all in my next video, and you take it easy.